Thank you, John, and good morning to everyone. Thank you again to PricewaterhouseCoopers for their sponsorship of this event, which I think speaks tremendously well of their commitment to the region that we're talking about. I'm Rick Smith, formerly a cleric of the Archdiocese of Canberra, and this must be a very difficult panel because it's got two co-chairs. On my left, Dr. Marty Natalegawa, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, and many other distinguished things now. On my right is Sue Thompson, an historian, Stephen Smith, who held the double, Foreign Minister and Defence Minister, now the trifecta of Professor at the University of Western Australia, and Richard Heydarian, commentator, academic on matters relating to security of the region. Having introduced colleagues here, I'll first ask Dr. Marty to offer a few comments about what he sees as the uncertainties that are defining the security environment in the region. Then I'll pass to Sue for some comment on the history, then Stephen, Richard. We have a vacant chair because Evelyn Go, the Shedden Professor of Strategy at ANU, is on her way. She will be here as we speak. Thank you. Marty, yes, the theme of our conference is prosperity and security in uncertain times. What do you see as the elements of uncertainty that we should be thinking about here?
Well, thank you very much, Rick, for that question. And I guess since I'm in a similar capacity as yours in terms of co-chairing this session, I won't be taking up too much time in saying what I wish to say, and prefer to listen to the panel's members as well. But since you asked that question, I guess it's extremely difficult to define what one means by uncertainty, because that's in the very nature of the entire subject matter. How do you actually manifest and try to identify the elements of uncertainties? But the key point that I wanted to emphasize is actually, as far as policymakers are concerned in the region, they should take this condition of uncertainties as a given. It's a fact of life, and they must try to manage this reality and respond and prepare themselves to anticipate and to respond to these dynamics. But I just wish to highlight two principal dynamics, if I may, in terms of uncertainty, and it's been echoed throughout the morning already. One is how to manage these shifts and dynamics, geopolitical dynamics and geo-economic dynamics that are prevalent in our region. I prefer to use dynamics rather than changing balances or distribution of power, because I think essentially our region is confronting this constant, never-ending vacillations and complex dynamics that we must find a way of navigating. How we embrace it as a given and not as necessarily as a challenge. And the second uncertainty, that is one dimension of uncertainty I want to bring forth to the discussion. The second one is how one addresses the uncertainty resulting from the nexus between internal and external issues. We are, especially in the diplomatic profession, readily assumes that there is a clear delineation between internal and external issues, when in fact in many instances, many of the problems, including security problems, confronted by the region are both of an external and internal character. And I feel that our region is bereft of sufficient the necessary mindset and the necessary infrastructure in terms of dealing with this multiple dimension type of crisis or challenge that are both internal and external. So this is basically geopolitical and intermestic, so to speak, international and domestic.
Thanks for that, Marty. I think they're both well-made points. It reminds me that in all the defence and foreign policy white papers I was involved with, we always began with a paragraph that said, we live in the most complex and fluid and uncertain times that Australia has ever faced. And you're right, we've got to learn to live with uncertainty, and we have. On the other hand, Sue, you're living with history, less uncertainty. I welcome your role here because, as I said to you, in that extraordinarily interesting discussion this morning with what I'll call the millennials, they were at risk, I thought, of air airbrushing Australia out of the history of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Okay, well, on that note, I will try and airbrush Australia back in. Historically, Australia was one of ASEAN's biggest fans in 1967 when ASEAN was first inaugurated. The Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Paul Hasler, made a statement welcoming the new institution. And ironically, actually, at the time, ASEAN's first declaration emphasised economic and cultural cooperation. They left out the word security, but Paul Hasler put that in his statement, where he welcomed the organisation because he saw it as paving the way for peace and stability in the region, which it did. There hasn't been conflict amongst the ASEAN states, and ironically, the creation of ASEAN came out of conflict. The negotiations for ASEAN first came out of the Bangkok talks to end the confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia, which was these negotiations were held in Bangkok. The Thais hosted it, and it was from those negotiations that they then started to talk about the participants about forming a wider organisation. However, regionalism it wasn't a new idea in 1967. We can trace it back to before the Second World War, and in fact us historians like to trace everything back to before. But in the 1940s, the Philippines, in the late 1940s, the Philippines came up with an idea of a Pacific Union, and Australia was involved. Australia was one of the more active supporters of this idea of a Pacific Union, and in particular the Filipino government wanted a non-communist organisation. They were concerned about the rise of China back then, ironically. In particular, a chap called Mao Zedong, who had just come to power in October 1949, and they were looking for some sort of response to this new regime in China and how they would respond to that. The reason why that organisation didn't succeed was partly because the Chinese nationalists at the time wanted to be involved, Chiang Kai-shek, and nobody wanted to be involved with him, and that's another story I won't go into. By that stage, he did not have much support, particularly from the United States, but also the Philippines wanted the United States to be involved, and they wanted active security participation from the United States, which the United States was not willing to give at the time. However, external powers have always supported regionalism in Southeast Asia. The United States has always wanted to support it. It's never wanted to actually be an active participant, but it has contributed greatly in terms of economic development for Southeast Asia and economic development with the individual ASEAN states. And this is where you see the beginnings of the interaction between internal, as you mentioned, the external factors and the internal factors. ASEAN has always evolved as an organisation that has the relationship between external powers. Each member state has always had their individual security bilateral relationships with external powers, even after the inauguration of ASEAN. But also the interaction between the actual nation states within ASEAN. And it's interesting that when I mentioned that security was not part of the initial declaration, Lee Kuan Yew, many decades later, he wrote in his autobiography that it was the unspoken assumption that ASEAN would be a security organisation, despite its declaration. And since then, ASEAN has been involved with certain security issues. Their first issue was in 1968 with the dispute in Sabah, a dispute between the Philippines and the Malaysians. And in fact, it was that dispute that kick-started this idea of non-intervention in member states. The Malaysians at one stage threatened to stop participating in ASEAN. They came to a resolution in 1969, and it was essentially to keep the dispute outside of the framework of the organisation, and that set the groundwork for this idea. And I think it's quite important when people talk about how integrated ASEAN should be, how active it is in security issues, that they have to be mindful that when there have been conflicts in the past between member states, that it has been problematic, and they've set the path of choosing to resolve these issues outside the framework. I think I've had my 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I could talk more, but
Thank you. You'll get that chance, Sue. Thank you very much. Stephen, from one West Australian Foreign Minister, Paul Hasluck, to another, going back over time from history to the postmodern, I think you were particularly identified during a period as Foreign Defence Minister with the increased focus on the Indian Ocean, the evolution of the term Indo-Pacific. Could you give us some background to that?
Yeah, very happy to. I might first just sort of start with a sense of history, as Sue set that scene. And His Highness the Shah made the point in his contribution about the big population numbers we find in Southeast Asia and Asia generally. I think from Australia's starting point, and I'll speak about Australia first, then ASEAN. From Australia's starting point, we're a one country, one continent, small population, large landmass country. And so that's caused us to always be concerned about our security, but also our economic prosperity. You can't have one without the other. So as a consequence of that, Australia's been very good at getting in on the ground floor. And so getting in as ASEAN's first dialogue partner is getting in on the ground floor. But we also got on the ground floor with a security partner post-World War II, the US. We got in on the ground floor with our developing economic relationships into North Asia, Japan, Korea, China. Japan, we had a trade agreement with Japan 12 years after the end of the war in the Pacific. So we've been very good at groundbreaking. We were also pretty quick to work out in the more modern era that something called the Asia Pacific was worthwhile being engaged in, and hence our work, which Gareth was involved with, in raising APEC from a Ministers' Forum to a Leaders' Forum, one of the great achievements of the Keating government. We've also been at the ground floor of identifying that this century is not the China century or the Asia Pacific century. This century is about more than that, and hence the notion of the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific was first used in an Australian government document in the 2013 Defence White Paper, and is writ large in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. The Foreign Policy White Paper can be summarised in 2 sentences. It's the Indo-Pacific - India and Indonesia, stupid, and it's a world rules-based order, stupid. That's quite straightforward. So what causes that? What causes that is that it's not just the ongoing economic and security endurance of the United States or the rise of China as a great power. It's also the rise of India as a great power. Yes, it's on a slower incline than China, but it's a country of 1.2 billion people. My view is it's going to end up in roughly the same place by the midpoint of the century. And it's also, from an ASEAN perspective, the rise of Indonesia, not just as a regional influence, but as a global influence. And we're guests of PwC. PwC are the only economic organisation in the world who said that by 2050 there'll be 4 great economies, not necessarily in this order: US, China, India, and Indonesia. And if it's not Indonesia by itself, it'll be Indonesia with the ASEAN economic community. And so, generally in history, rise of economic power plus a bit of population generally tends to lead to rise of strategic power, political power, military power, geopolitical influence. So by the midpoint of this century, my own analysis is that it'll be the Indo-Pacific stupid, and that's why Australia has gotten in again on the ground floor, seeing that coming. From an Australian perspective, that means the 2 most important things that Australia can do, in my view, are to enhance our relationship with India to the same sort of level that we see with the United States, China, Japan, Korea, and to raise our relationship with Indonesia to the same economic level as those countries. Despite most people in the room being Indonesia tragics, or Australian tragics if you're guests from Indonesia, our trade and investment stats are terrible. And so the 2 most important things that Australia can do from an economic prosperity and security point of view is to enhance substantially our relationship with India and Indonesia. We've been a successful economy because we've been a great trading country, but also an attractive place for overseas direct foreign investment, which has generally followed our trading partners: Europe, US, Japan, Korea, China. The next big licks of foreign investment into Australia, in my view, can only come from India and Indonesia. And if we're not careful, Indonesia and India will look north, not south, to North America, North Asia, Asia and to Europe. So from a selfish Australian point of view, growing those two relationships is the most important thing that we can do. And that's the notion of the Indo-Pacific. It's not something to be dismissed as it was by the Chinese foreign minister the other day as sea froth. I don't think you can dismiss India nor Indonesia as sea froth. It's an enduring concept because those countries will be enduringly successful economies, democracies and powers. So what does that mean for ASEAN? When ASEAN's created, there of course are two great world powers, USA and USSR. And the Soviet Union had zero economic activity in Southeast Asia or generally. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see US for a short period of time be the unipolar power. Now we're seeing the rise of China, so there's going to be shared power, rise of India, shared again, and then rise of Indonesia and ASEAN as the fourth significant economy. So we're moving into a multipolar world. When Southeast Asia created ASEAN, it was in the context of confrontasi, threat of communism, and wanting to be interdependent and self-reliant. ASEAN has never seen a phase where one of two things has occurred, where an ASEAN member has itself been a great economic power on a world scale, and that potential for Indonesia confronts ASEAN into the future, nor has ASEAN had to confront a world where there is economic and security competition in its own part of the world, as there is now between China and the United States. So how does ASEAN grapple with that? And how do some of the great pillars of ASEAN respond to that? With ASEAN centrality, my own view is that ASEAN centrality and the architecture around that, it's essential from Australia's and ASEAN's point of view that continue. And the best example of that now is the East Asia Summit, where presidents and prime ministers from all the key countries, US, China, India, Australia, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, get together on a regular basis once a year, as do the foreign ministers, as do the defence ministers every second year, soon to be every first minister. So the East Asia Summit is now the glue that holds those dialogues together. The ASEAN Regional Forum is no longer plays that role if it ever did. So ASEAN's centrality on the architecture is unambiguously in ASEAN's favour and interest as it is in Australia. ASEAN consensus is a different issue now for ASEAN and for the rest of us. With two competing powers in the Asia Pacific and soon to be a third competing power in the Indo-Pacific, how does ASEAN respond to the notion of consensus where some people might say, for example, that Laos and Cambodia now provide a shield for China and are used by China to prevent consensus in ASEAN, to stop ASEAN doing what other countries in ASEAN or ASEAN itself believes are in its own interests. Here's where the rubber hits the road on the modern era. What exacerbates this dynamic or power shift? It's uncertainty caused by Trump, and it's now uncertainty caused by Chinese assertiveness. For the last 10 years, most of us have grown up saying to ourselves, we seem confident that China will be a responsible stakeholder, that they're chasing prosperity, that they're not proposing to be assertive or to expand their powers. Well, over the last 18 months to 2 years, that's had to be revised in some manner or form. Flagrant ignoring of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's near unanimous decision on the South China Sea, where, as an international lawyer, I'm an international legal cap, clearly contrary to international law. Economic threats to Korea over THAAD. Dubious engagement in domestic affairs of some countries, including in Australia. What else can I think of? Trying to use Marty's right over Bhutan in the Doklam, which engaged India, and a range of other things I've probably forgotten. So Trump uncertainty, and of course the main one of recent weeks, Xi Jinping now being emperor for life. So our old model of responsible stakeholder has now got a very serious question mark. Our old model of engagement by the US economically and strategically and in a security sense in our part of the world, now question mark, and the worst thing that Trump has done, withdraw from the TPP. So you add a changing dynamic, a changing world, and uncertainty from two of the great powers does cause us to say Australia and ASEAN have got some serious issues to talk about. And consensus is one of those. Enduring centrality, I think, is very important, as I've stated earlier. Finally, if you look at the snapshot history, there's no doubt that ASEAN's creation has been an unambiguous success from a prosperity and security point of view for Southeast Asia, but it's also been an unambiguous success for Australia. And I am one of those ones who says that on the 50th anniversary and with the summit, Australia should be saying to itself, we should be thinking about going from dialogue partner to a greater involvement in ASEAN. That is unquestionably in our own long-term economic, strategic and political interests. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and very appropriate for you to emphasise the linkage between security and the economy. You can't have one without the other. It's often overlooked in the debate in Australia. Evelyn, welcome, Professor Evelyn Go. Evelyn, I should say, did volunteer before we started to go last. And so you'll have time then to pick up the drift of our discussion here. But Richard, firstly, as you sit there in Manila, I know you have a region-wide view as well. How do you see those elements of uncertainty that Stephen has referred to?
Well, lest I be misunderstood as an ASEAN basher, which tends to be my reputation in certain countries, let me be very clear that I'm a firm believer in ASEAN. And having spent a decade in a region like the Middle East, how I wish we had something like the ASEAN in that place. And I think the ASEAN has to be committed for creating a de facto security regime whereby even the threat of use of war as an instrument of foreign policy among ASEAN countries is increasingly unthinkable, if not already unthinkable. Nonetheless, I think last year was a critical stage in ASEAN's history. I think last year, in my opinion, made us realize that ASEAN is increasingly facing a midlife crisis. I called it a middle institutionalization trap. It's kind of like the notion of middle income trap. The kind of institutional configurations and decision-making procedures that allowed ASEAN to come this far, having such a diverse number of countries under one roof, that kind of configuration, in my opinion, is no longer enough for the ASEAN to face the new challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, particularly the rise of China. So for long, we have worried about the fact that external powers will divide and conquer ASEAN and prevent ASEAN from coming up with a unified position. I think what happened last year was a little bit more disconcerting, because what happened was the chairman of the ASEAN, the Philippines, that year essentially was telling the world not to mind major issues like the South China Sea issue. We had President Duterte very clearly saying that the South China Sea issues should be left alone or to themselves. You had a very interesting scenario in the ASEAN Regional Forum whereby our foreign minister essentially was telling Australia, United States, and Japan not to raise the arbitration issue. The fact is saying it is our sovereign right not to assert our sovereign rights under the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in 2006. And I think that was reminiscent or reflection of the bigger systemic problem that we have in ASEAN. There's nothing wrong with consultation or mushawara, but the goal should not be unanimity per se, but the goal should be using mushawara to come up with a sense of at least consensus that has not to be necessarily unanimity. I think the problem in the ASEAN is that by insisting on unanimity as our interpretation of consensus, we make it impossible for ourselves almost to come up with a unified position on issues whether it's the Rohingya crisis, because one member country has direct interest of making sure no one intervenes there, or South China Sea, whereby China can use multiple partner countries within the ASEAN to block any kind of consensus on that. Now, this is where the Indo-Pacific concept is important to me, because it would mean two different things, diametrically opposed things for the ASEAN. On one hand, the emergence of the quadrilateral alliance would mean a new mechanism to actually essentially replace ASEAN as an engine of regional integration. This idea that the ASEAN could no longer constrain China's ambitions, and therefore other major powers should come and deal with that issue. But on the other hand, the Quad also mean an alternative mechanism to actually strengthen the ASEAN. And I think over the past few years, we have seen very encouraging developments whereby members of the Quad whereas Japan, through development of Coast Guard capabilities of certain ASEAN claimant states in the South China Sea, or Australia through assistance in counterterrorism to the Philippines in the case of Marawi, or through India providing capacity building kind of assistance through the ASEAN Secretariat and different ASEAN mechanism, or the United States through the Maritime Security Initiative trying to help different countries to develop surveillance capacities. So we also can see a Quad as a way to help bridge the gaps whereby the ASEAN has not been able to rise up to the occasion. And I think this is the context within which increasingly we have to consider even the discussion of closer partnership between Australia and other Quad countries and the ASEAN. We have been having even a discussion of possible associate membership of Australia within ASEAN. I know Marty and Stephen's point on this, there is some skepticism about that idea, but I think it's time for us to think about the unthinkable, because the kind of uncertainty we're facing is a new abnormal. It's not the kind of uncertainties we faced in the past, whereby the reigning superpower is no longer committed, at least it seems to us, to undergirding the existing order, while China is quite openly challenging the existing order in defiance of the kind of principles and rules and norms that the ASEAN has been pushing forward and now are being flagrantly ignored.
Thank you, Richard. It's a challenging thought, the Quad's feeding into ASEAN in this way, and we may well come back to it. But Evelyn, thank you again for rushing, and I hope you've had time to draw breath and think about it. In your email to me, you foreshadowed a couple of very interesting points about differences between Australian and ASEAN perceptions and strategic interests, and I'd be very happy to draw you out on that if we might.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rick. First of all, my sincere apologies for walking in at this point. It was unfortunate somebody ended up on the tracks on the train just a station out of the airport, so there was a delay on transport. I'm sorry about this.
Unfortunate for them too, I think. Yes.
It was very unfortunate for them, was what I meant, yes. So coming in a little bit late to this conversation, it occurs to me that it may be useful, if it hasn't yet come up this morning, to reflect on ASEAN's very particular and also peculiar ascendance over the last 25 years or so. I think when we talk about ASEAN in this country, we often imbue it with a certain degree of mythical character. We expect a certain degree of coherence, consensus, unanimity almost, and we take for granted its claims to some sort of centrality and to occupation of the driver's seat in the region. It's probably quite worthwhile to step back and think about this a little bit, and to think about how unusual this has been, and what an achievement it has been, but nevertheless how unusual it has been. That for the last 25 years since the end of the Cold War, we've had a collection of disparate 10 small and medium-sized countries claiming that position of leadership in forging the new regional security and economic and indeed political architecture in East Asia in this period. I'm increasingly coming to the sense that we've lived through a little bit of an anomaly in this post-Cold War period. The realists would have us believe that real life is coming back to the fore, and we're headed back towards power politics of the genre that we'd all, either as direct Cold Warriors or as students of the Cold War would recognize well. I'm not making that point. What I'm simply saying is that it's been unusual, ASEAN's ascendance and centrality in the regional system over the last 25 years. We may want to reconsider this as we face the sorts of issues that Stephen and I'm sure the others have talked about on this panel. And I'd like to highlight 2 points, well perhaps three points in the short amount of time that I have, because the first one connects to the second two. The first point, very brief general one, is that I think the conversation, when we think about Australia and ASEAN's future together in terms of cooperation, is an identity point. It's fashionable to say that geopolitics is back. And we stop and think what geopolitics is 2 things. One is location, obviously, it's geography. And the second one is who are we and who are you, right? And what do we want to privilege in terms of what is connected to what and whom is connected to whom? in a more important way than being connected to others. So what we're seeing in the rise of geopolitics in the region is a reconfiguration of the priority of who is more important to different players in the region. This is not unusual. It's not unusual for ASEAN. It's not unusual for the region as a whole. We sit in a country that has spent a great deal of its history constructing this imagined community, projecting across long historical and geographical distances. We sit in a region that has spent the last 25 years believing in the Asia-Pacific, which to show on a map projection, you've got to cut the standard map in half and join them up again in order to belie that distance that, separates the two sides of the Pacific. So we're in this reimagination again. And obviously, as Stephen said, of the competing geographical or geopolitical imaginations out there, the Asia-Pacific, the Belt and Road, the Indo-Pacific is the one that most logically connects Australia and Southeast Asia. For Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific is particularly interesting because, and this comes into my second point, it promises a return to Southeast Asia's traditional role in world politics. Southeast Asia traditionally, historically, and geographically is a thoroughfare. That word's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, but it's a thoroughfare. Southeast Asia only makes sense historically and culturally if you understand it as what it is, which is that connection between India and China. It is traditionally brought together continentally and in maritime fashion, the Pacific and East Asia, and the Indian Ocean and the subcontinent. That's what it is. The Indo-Pacific, therefore, and this is not something we hear about a lot because we don't talk about it a great deal in Southeast Asia yet. The Indo-Pacific notion promises to return Southeast Asia to that thoroughfare role that it has played in world history. I think that understanding Southeast Asia as this thoroughfare and this crossroads, if you like, helps us to understand a few important things about what can and cannot be achieved with Southeast Asian security terms. First of all, being a thoroughfare means that Southeast Asia expects that there will be multiple influences in the region. The last 25 years were unusual. American hegemony is not the norm. Hegemony of any sort in political terms is not the norm for a thoroughfare region. It expects to be influenced by multiple great powers, multiple civilizational forces, as it always has been. This means that when Southeast Asians sit down and think about security order coming in the years ahead, they don't tend to think, well, which power do we prefer? That's not the question. The question tends to be, how are we going to manage these multiple powers? Right? Because they're here. There's not a lot we can do about it. How do we manage and how do we optimize the opportunities that come in the wake of these multiple influences in the region? It's worth emphasizing this because it's a little bit different than how Australians instinctively think about the same questions. The first question that comes to the Australian mind is, which side do we choose? Which great and powerful friend will we pick next? Right? It's quite a different starting point. This leads to different expectations. Hence that very well-worn path of don't expect Southeast Asians to swing hard to your side. You're going to start World War III. Right? Because that's not what thoroughfare countries do. Right? It closes off options unnecessarily. Secondly, optimizing medium and long-term options, this is worth repeating, means not choosing sides. Not choosing sides not because Southeast Asian countries want to play both sides, or not because they've got nothing better to do and they can't make up their minds, but because not choosing sides precludes having to close windows of opportunity. Right? It's how Southeast Asians tend to think about it. So at the end of the day, just to draw a line under this second point, thinking about ASEAN-Australia cooperation in the years going ahead in security terms, we want to think about how to leverage that Southeast Asian identity as a connector between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, between China and India. Now, connectivity plays both ways. You connect good stuff and you connect bad stuff, right? But how do you leverage that connector role of Southeast Asia? Would be the question I would ask. My final point returns to Stephen's point about what I would call the economic security nexus in the region. Again, this is a very well-known point. It's very hard to talk about security in Southeast Asia without the economic side of security being paramount. Again, this is a slight difference between how Australians and Southeast Asians tend to think about security off the bat. This is changing a little bit now, but it's still a slight difference. And Southeast Asia, as Stephen observed, is undergoing a very significant transition. It's moving from what used to be the periphery of the world economy, right, into what is going to be, what is indeed probably already the center, the cauldron of the world economic system, partly because of the rise of China, but also because of the internal dynamics in the growth of the middle class, the young populations, the potential consumer markets of Southeast Asia. So it's moving from the periphery into the very heart of the world economy. This creates dynamism, but this also creates a great deal of challenges. What we're seeing is that the size of the pie is massively increasing, the economic pie in Southeast Asia. There is also necessarily more than one game in town in terms of political, in terms of the political economy. This comes back to my earlier point about foreign affairs. Southeast Asia has never tried to say we're not going to reap the economic benefits of China rising. That's never been on the table. Of course they're going to reap the optimal benefits of China rising, preferably not at the expense of anything else. Traditional European markets, traditional Japanese technology, the US's very important role economically in the region. But it's not a zero-sum game, is the bottom line. At the same time though, in some of the particularly commercial rhetoric about Southeast Asia's economic promise, one quite fundamental point still tends to get elided, if not outright ignored. We're not talking about a region that is coherent or all at the same phase of development. This remains economically an extremely diverse region. This means that there are economic challenges disaggregated across the 10 ASEAN countries. A large proportion of Southeast Asia is still made up of transitional economies which are still trying to overcome some very basic challenges of how do you create one economic space out of what used to be disparate provinces, ethnic insurgent-prone regions, border conflicts, etc., etc. Significant proportions of ASEAN economies are still at that stage. Other ASEAN economies have leapfrogged in significant ways, but remain trapped in fairly significant transitionary politics. How do you make a transition, given a huge influx of Chinese investment in recent years in Marty's country, Indonesia, for example, where established patterns of patronage, economic benefits, established distributions of economic benefits are significantly being disrupted by the ever larger, ever increasing size of the pie because of China's investment. And new economic interests are coming into play with political impacts. These remain critical challenges in large economies in Southeast Asia. At the same time, of course, at the ASEAN level, ASEAN's trying to build two economic integration enterprises. One is internal. This is the ASEAN Economic Community, with its inherent difficult problems of intra-ASEAN distribution and representation. The other is that bigger integrated East Asian enterprise of how to yoke the rest of the Southeast Asian economies optimally to the Chinese behemoth, if we put it that way. Now, one would expect that there's going to be a range of contradictions, competing interests, and outright conflicts, if you like, in these multiple levels of economic transitions which are going on in the region. When Australia looks at ASEAN and tries to consider how do we optimize cooperation, one of the key things that we're going to have to think about is how to navigate these multiple levels of the economic game, which is central to security in the region. I have no simple answers there. There will be others in the room who are much better qualified than I am to provide some good answers. But I'll leave these on the table for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. My co-chair, Marty.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. I just wanted to, for panelists, if they can, to expand further on the notion of the Indo-Pacific, if I may. But before doing that, I'd just like to share my own thoughts on what the whole Indo-Pacific notion is all about, and especially to put some context to our discussion. Contrary to suggestion, as far as ASEAN is concerned, and personally, as I recall, and we have here the Secretary General of ASEAN, Ong Keng Yong, who is with us in this room. We began to have conversation, at least not explicitly, but implied within ASEAN on the Indo-Pacific region all the way back in 2002-2003, when the debate and discussion on the so-called Asia-Pacific community that Japan was proposing. Australia came up as well with the East Asia community, and then ASEAN was wrestling on how best to respond to these developments. And of course, at the time, we had the prospect of Malaysia about to chair the ASEAN in 2005, extremely keen to have some kind of an East Asia moment, because that former Prime Minister Marty had his own East Asia caucus to propose. So, in other words, at the time, there was an accelerated wish to realize some kind of an East Asia setting process. But I remember at the time, there was a huge debate even within ASEAN, whether it was to remain essentially a +3 driven process, or whether it should be wider. And I remember Indonesia consistently and purposefully and deliberately making the case for Australia, India, and New Zealand's inclusion explicitly to ensure that this is from the beginning an Indo-Pacific project. You just look at the map. If you were to have only the +3 as a driver, ASEAN will be simply an added on. Whereas if you have India, New Zealand, Australia at the southern end, even geographically, you make ASEAN central. But then we have to move beyond geography. We have to talk about the dynamics. That's why the Cebu principles, are the principles that ASEAN officials, ministers then set as a criterion for membership of the then East Asia Summit. We set it as a criterion, one, dialogue partner of ASEAN, and then you have to accede to the TAC, and then of course the last one is substantive relations with ASEAN. So from the very beginning, we were making sure that the Indo-Pacific perspective is consistent with ASEAN. You can't do Indo-Pacific without doing ASEAN at the same time. It was a deliberate, purposeful, and I remember having to struggle within ASEAN to make that case. Because there was even a debate about the definition of East Asia, not geographically, but in terms of social construct. Are we including India and Australia and New Zealand as an East Asian identity? But we won the debate then. We eventually persevere, and we have Australia right there from the beginning. And then we refined it by having Australia, the United States and Russia join in 2011. But the point that I wanted to make is that we, as ASEAN, we had a vision. I had a notion of what I called then dynamic equilibrium. I wanted to see an absence of preponderant power in the region, creating dynamics in the region where basically we all speak of common security and common perspective, and we have the Bali principles of 2011, externalizing ASEAN experience beyond the region, connecting the outer dots, the TAC for the Indo-Pacific. But for whatever reason, which it is what it is, ASEAN choose to leave this script behind. In 2014, in May 2014, at the ASEAN Summit in Myanmar, references to Indo-Pacific still was there. In October 2014, it dropped out of ASEAN's lexicon. Then ASEAN begins to speak of the wider region rather than Indo-Pacific. And it was only Mr. President Trump's visit in October that reinvigorate ASEAN to start to look for its old script and to try to find what is their vision on this Indo-Pacific. But the point that I want to suggest, to ask our panelists to consider is, what kind of dynamics do you wish to instill in the Indo-Pacific? Because we in our region, in ASEAN, we will have problem if the Indo-Pacific idea is somehow hijacked to become a containment perspective. Because in our view, the Indo-Pacific was always inclusionary, common security, common prosperity, externalizing ASEAN experience, ASEAN connecting the outer gods. And here is where our ASEAN colleagues must not be found wanting. They must win the geopolitical debate. They can't just be simply an excellent convener of meetings. They must provide ideas. And this is where I hope our Australian colleagues can also share with us when they speak of Indo-Pacific and the Quad and the like. Is it in addition to the East Asia Summit, or are you, because we spent a lot of political capital to get Australia in from the beginning. And we don't wish to see a distraction, another project that we know for sure it will not fly in the region, if only for the messengers who are bringing the message. Because there is not a comfort level in East Asia for those who are proposing this kind of a more restricted type of definition of rules. But I'd like to seek some of the thoughts of the panelists on this.
Sue or Stephen, would you like to?
One thing I will say from a historical perspective, also from a literary perspective, you sort of wonder about Shakespeare's term, what's in a name. But historically, it's interesting, this idea of regions, and I think Southeast Asia as a region wasn't really sort of talked about until perhaps the 1930s when the British set up their Southeast Asia Command. But after the Second World War, when the Philippines came up with this idea of Pacific Union, it included all of Asia. They were courting, the Philippine president at the time, Quirino, was courting Nehru over in India. And this idea of the Pacific, it wasn't even just Pacific Rim. And it was to do with his aspirations of how to deal with communism in Asia, the advancement of communism. And Australia was part of those negotiations. So Australia at the time was quite keen, as was New Zealand, to be part of a Pacific Union. By the time we get to ASEAN in the 60s, it's very much a Southeast Asia organisation, and ASEAN came out of even smaller organisations. ASEAN came out of the ASA, which was the Association of Southeast Asia, which had 3 members. And I think what's important to realise when you compare what was going on in the 40s to what was going on in the 60s is how the world had changed, and how the political aspirations of the countries joining these clubs, you've got to see what their motives are and what they're, and by the 1960s Australia wasn't interested in being a member of an Asian club, where they were interested in the 1940s, and one of the main reasons back then was this concern for security in the Pacific. And we have always been quite concerned about the security around our borders. By the 1960s, very much as you talk about economic development, ASEAN was very much considered to be a vehicle for economic development as a means to achieve stability. And therefore Australia, there wasn't the need for Australia to be involved. Australia was more interested in less integrated organisations like CETO, and then further on past into organisations like APEC. And also another thing you have to take into account is the aspirations of political leaders too. And different political leaders have different aspirations. Certainly our interest in regionalism had a resurgence under Whitlam. He was very strongly in favour of Asia-Pacific regionalism.
Well, the last couple of years I've travelled to North Asia and to India and other parts of our region where, as a foreign or defence minister, I put an argument about the Indo-Pacific, which was simply a concept which said it's not just ongoing United States economic and strategic influence, it's not just the rise of China, it's It's also the rise of India as a great power. It's also the rise of Indonesia, because by the midpoint of this century, they're going to be the big four economies. It's the Indo-Pacific student. And I was met with very polite responses to those arguments. In the last 18 months when I've gone, particularly to Japan and India, I've been greeted with enthusiasm for the concept, but also being told that these were Indian or Japanese ideas, which tells you that it doesn't matter who first thought of the idea is now a reality, because nothing can stand in the way. Well, let me cater that. It is possible that countries and economies can fail, but on current projections, nothing will stand in the way of economic, strategic, military influence being dragged from the Pacific and North Asia, US and China, south and west, because of the rise of India and the rise of Indonesia. And as Marty and Evelyn has said, doesn't matter how you draw the lines on the map, there's only one way you get there, and that's through Southeast Asia. So the Indo-Pacific construct it's Hollywood to Bollywood. And you can't have a piece of the regional architecture to deal with that. So you have Pacific Island Forum, IORA, you have ASEAN. But what works for ASEAN and what works for Australia? At the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific is ASEAN and Australia. And what works for both of us is the East Asia Summit. And no one should underappreciate the significance of what Marty said in terms of Indonesia understanding that the East Asia Summit had to be expanded. It couldn't just be a +3. It had to include other countries. And Marty would never say this in public, I will. Australia, Indonesia and Singapore urged the United States to join the East Asia Summit and entered into a conspiracy to effect that, which was an unambiguously good thing from all of our perspectives. And that's what saw Russia and the US go in as well to make the 10+8. So that does form the basis of the regional / geopolitical architecture. There's nothing quite like diplomacy. You can do a lot of good just by turning up. And when presidents, foreign ministers and defense ministers from US, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, all turn up to East Asia Summit, that helps. The Quad is not the Indo-Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific is not the Quad. Quad 1.0 was a one-off meeting of junior officials and possibly a Malabar exercise, although the Indians deny that. Quad 2.0 is currently a one-off meeting of junior officials. Well, actually they're more senior officials, much more senior officials, but the Quad may or may not lead to a piece of the architecture. I'm generally the Australian who is credited with having caused the demise of Quad 1.0, but I never saw anyone from India, Japan or the United States over the following 8 years do anything to suggest that it should be reinvigorated. It's an idea which has
breathed a sigh of relief, as I remember.
Yeah, it has emerged over the last 18 months. So the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific is not the Quad, and should not be. People should not try and define it accordingly. Having said that, other pieces of the architecture, in addition to the East Asia Summit, might help. So if you accept that Indonesia and India are on the rise and inextricably interwoven with our economic and security future, then why wouldn't you say maybe it might be a good idea for India, Indonesia and Australia to do a trilate, just as India, Australia and Japan currently do? Maybe it might be a good idea for Indonesia, Japan and Australia to do a trilate. So all of these fabrics, I think, help. And they help particularly in times of uncertainty where you're not quite sure what the long-term US brand will be post-Trump or the US engagement will be post-Trump. And as I outlined before, and I think the only thing I forgot to put in the Chinese assertiveness camp was the Singapore freeze from Melbourne to Melbourne Road. No country's been put in the freeze since France was put in the freeze over the Dalai Lama some years ago. So Chinese assertiveness, US uncertainty adds to the notion that trying to join all of these dots, which is a very ASEAN thing to do, is actually a really good thing to do, and we should be thinking of more. Finally, on containment. You can't contain a country of 1.2 billion people, whether it's China or India. All you can seek to do is to influence and balance, and to try and put countries into a position where might is not always right, and where countries who do have might will think first and talk first before unilaterally using it.
Richard?
Well, I used to think it's always best to be last because you have more time to think about things, but I'm increasingly running out of ideas because they have been exhaustively discussed by the previous speakers. But I think there are three competing visions of what an Indo-Pacific paradigm can look like. Of course, the first one was what Marty was talking about, this threat of a Quad 2.0 emerging that focuses on not containment but constrainment of China. The problem with that is the whole discourse of constrainment of China, the whole discourse of Quad as containing China could be provocative enough to fuel Chinese maritime assertiveness, but never be really robust and crystallized enough to really deter China from pushing the envelope in adjacent waters. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing today. Whenever the United States does something like the freedom of navigation operations, it's automatically used by the Chinese as a justification to further deepen their militarization and reclamation activities, even though the FONOPs were never really tough enough to really stop the Chinese from doing that. So I think you would essentially have the same dilemma, but on steroids, if we go with a xenocentric kind of constrainment-driven notion of the Indo-Pacific. And I think Shinzo Abe's, for instance, notion of the security diamond, Admiral Harrison, Ambassador Harris' interpretation of the Indo-Pacific kind of tracks with that xenocentric notion of the Indo-Pacific. The second way of looking at it is much more moderated and much more inclusive, which is essentially a post-American Indo-Pacific paradigm, whereby we recognize that no matter who is the American president, whether it's someone like Trump or Hillary Clinton, America's relative structural decline is almost set in motion. And we have to deal with the fact that we cannot rely on America to undergird the existing order for foreseeable future, and it's up to other powers to come forward. And I think the whole Indo-Pacific, the word itself says that India is one of the pillars of a post-American order, whereby you can have Americanism without the American power. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind. And given the Trump administration's very strong assault on notions like free trade, among other things, I think the impetus for other powers to step up to the plate is there. The third vision, I think, is really an Indo-Pacific which creates a much more inclusive regional security architecture with the ASEAN in the very middle. What ASEAN brings to the picture, and I think Evelyn talked about this very well, is geography, right? Although I don't think we in ASEAN want to be called a thoroughfare. Our egos no longer accept that. I think we want to be called something more than that. But the reality is that ASEAN will be at the very center, at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific geographical region. And what ASEAN brings to the table is the convening power. Because when you deal with ASEAN, you deal with 10 countries at the same time. And it's the 10 countries that has created all of these different mechanisms. I may slightly disagree with the idea that ARF is no longer as important compared to East Asia Summit. I think both of them are very important. And remember, ARF is one of the few multilateral mechanisms whereby the North Korea, in the post-six-party talks world, actually engaged directly with other leaders. So last year, you had the foreign minister of North Korea meeting Duterte. You had Duterte and leaders in ASEAN talking about how ASEAN could help South Korea to be dealing the Korean Peninsula problem. So I think these are the things that ASEAN brings to the table. And despite all my criticism of the ASEAN, I think no one can deny that the Indo-Pacific paradigm will not be an inclusive one unless the ASEAN is at the very center of that process. And the other thing that the ASEAN brings is that although in actuality the ASEAN has problems with democracy, with freedom, among other things, at least in terms of norms, there is a clear overlap between what ASEAN aspires to and what other members of the Quad, the Australia, Americans, Indians, and the Japanese are also believing in. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. While Evelyn just collects thoughts on that, I just make the point that to the extent that I contributed to the development of the notion of Indo-Pacific, it was from what I'll call a military strategic point of view. There is one strategic system that embraces the sea lanes from the Persian Gulf to Japan and beyond, and that essentially embraces Southeast Asia. Of course, our sea lanes join in there, but that is the strategic system that I'm talking of, and that doesn't diminish in any way. In fact, it enhances the role of ASEAN, and it provides makes room, as it were, for India and China. I've never quite understood why the Chinese are so anxious about it. It does, in fact, if you like, certify a role for them in the Indian Ocean as it does India in the Pacific. Evelyn.
Funny enough, I was going to make a related point, but I think
That is funny.
no, it's not funny in that way. Coincidentally, I was about to make the same point, which is, every time we look at these maps and you think about it, it's always occurred to me as very strange that you've got, putting on our American hegemony hats for a moment, you've got CENTCOM and then you've got PACOM. And then you kind of always left wondering what happens to the bit between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I suppose, and to be quite serious about this, operationally, if we were able to make this a maritime concept that makes operational sense, which it already does, for many naval people or commercial maritime people, it's about putting that chapeau on something which already exists in that sense. So it's not necessarily an issue about containment at all. It's about filling a gap in strategic and operational imagination. Now, of course, the issue, as we all know, it's not that the rose smells good, it's what's it called, right, to come back to Sue's point, because it's all about what it's called, and Marty's point, it's all about who's seen to be pushing it. And Australia's had this problem repeatedly in the region. I don't know, and I can't really offer you a really good analysis of why this is the case. But good Australian ideas have tended to have to be mediated through others within ASEAN for them to take root. And I've been sat here quietly in my corner trying to think about an alternative for the Indo-Pacific. But being a geographer by training, I can't, because the Indo-Pacific makes geographical sense. So the challenge is for someone else to come up with this label that would, I think, do the following things, right, in practice. What we want to think about is how to not dilute, but diversify the strategic landscape so that our imaginations are no longer completely dominated by ideas of the Asia-Pacific or even East Asia, right? It's about pulling out, as the other panelists have talked about, the concept of the region, not as an alternative, overarching, dominant interpretation, but another key one that's on the table that has operational, commercial, and political sense to it. We're living in an age of diversification, right? So what are the key sets of regions we're going to play with is going to be important. And if you want to make sure that the Indo-Pacific is there, then it needs to have a saleable label and operational sense, I think is the point here. Now if you think about it, much of this already exists. What we want to give it is impetus, I think, so that it creates this idea that this is not just a single game, there is not just a single game in town, in decline, waiting for an alternative single game to take over. That's not how it works in the current international system. But we've got to give some flesh to this skeletal concept at the moment, skeletal politically, because we haven't quite found the right hook to hang it on, I suppose, is the issue. By the way, if you don't do this, right, the Belt and Road will remain the only big transcontinental, transregional idea out there, is all I'm going to say. Right? So it's probably worth putting some effort into this one.
Marty, Evelyn's made this interesting point that could Australian ideas have to be mediated in ASEAN? We might return to that for a whole other seminar. Are we sure it's just simply not invented here syndrome?
No, I think partnership is the key issue here. I mean, Australia clearly brings to the table the discussion within ASEAN certain elements that is missing within ASEAN itself. But in reality, as in many instances, whenever Australia wishes to project certain ideas and initiatives, it has always been far more, realistic to partner with one of the ASEAN member states, whether it be on counterterrorism, on people smuggling, on other issues. But it is what it is. case, and I don't think that should be seen as necessarily reflective, reflecting negatively on Australia's diplomatic weight and heft and capacity. It's just the way the system works. On the Cambodian conflict, for example, which Gareth obviously is very much principled, that was also a manifestation of Indonesia, Australia partnership on the way to manage the issue. And there will, I'm sure there will be many more examples to come. But the point is that the point that I wanted to emphasize, since we are in an ASEAN-Australia setting, is that for Australia not to lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of goodwill in ASEAN to be working with and working through, and not to unnecessarily grow impatient and exasperated by the way ASEAN conduct business, and then trying to find alternative processes that may not be actually as effective as has been the case with ASEAN.
I've neglected the floor, but I know time is running out. You mentioned Gareth. We know that he awaits at lunch. But can we take one question, Nick?
Don't worry. Bill up. Hang on, Nick. There's one coming. Sure.
Time's running down, I think, John, isn't it? Take a question.
Two quick things. One, given this panel on security, I think it's important to emphasise that if you're thinking from an Indo-Pacific point of view, there is still really significant differences on the east side of the Malacca Straits versus the west side of the Malacca Straits in terms of the kinds of security challenges you face. On the east side, the major challenges are to do with major, strong states with capacity, ambition, will, and everything. On the west side, it's all to do with, but significantly about weak and uneconomic states with poor capacity and poor national. So when you're trying to integrate these things, they're still pretty distinct strategic systems. But the question I've got for the panel is, we've heard a lot about inclusive conceptions of security. How do we do inclusive security programs given the two big elephants in the room, which is the US and China increasingly in a pretty rivalry, a mode of operation which is increasingly cantankerous and viewed very much through almost zero-sum conceptions of where their security advantage and disadvantage goes. How do smaller states like Australia, like ASEAN and others engage inclusively with two great powers that are beginning to lock horns?
Thanks, Nick. Marty, can I call on your formidable diplomatic experience to tell us how to do that?
Hardly, but I would suggest to ASEAN. I think because ASEAN has provided the comfort level both for the US and China, not only convening power, but until recently as well, a capacity to bring all parties together in terms of substance. I'd like to make specific reference, for example, within the East Asia Summit in 2011, the countries of the East Asia Summit agreed to what's called the Bali Principles, where basically the notion of non-use of force, peaceful settlement of disputes have been agreed among East Asian Summit countries. This is not a reinforcement of the TAC between ASEAN or respect of TAC by non-ASEAN to ASEAN's commitment, but it's actually connecting that outer dots. We are TACing in terms of principles the outer edges of ASEAN, and I think that is why in the past I've spoken of the need to make this a legally binding commitment. What a tremendously important decompressing impact it would have if countries of the region, notwithstanding all tremendous problems that they have, at least to be able to say, we'll sort it out through diplomacy. That's all that's required. And the point that, back to the original question, I think ASEAN provides in a way like a buffer for all these external dynamics to be able to be fleshed out in ASEAN's context. But for that to continue to be relevant, again, ASEAN must earn that role. ASEAN cannot simply be good at convening meetings. It must offer, it must lead. Otherwise, you're just all sitting there, trying to be led somewhere, but ASEAN is passive. And this is where there will be an a la carte approach by countries looking for securities elsewhere. So My answer is ASEAN is the modality, but ASEAN must not be found wanting.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and on behalf of both of us tonight, thank our panel members and our attentive audience. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have lunch on upstairs, 2 floors up, and we'll be convening for a session chaired by Ali Moore. So if I can encourage you to make haste upstairs and reconvene and then have your chit-chats up there, please. Let's move up there and enjoy lunch together. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Marty. Thank you. Return this.